We're delighted to have with us today Dr. Louis A. Dunn. He was the former U.S. ambassador and senior expert in arms control and non-proliferation. He served as assistant director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, ACDA, during the Reagan administration. He contributed to major U.S. Soviet arms control efforts during a period of heightened Cold War tension. And of course, he played key roles in both the 1985 and 95 NPT Review Conferences and subsequent extension. Dr. Dunn, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
I want to start off with your background, how you got into this field. Can you tell us a bit about your background, your education, your early career, and how you came into arms control as your professional field?
I originally had a PhD from the University of Chicago, where I studied, among others, with Albert Wohlstetter, sort of one of the deans of the deterrence movement. I then went to a small college, Kenyon College, decided I didn't want to be a college professor, and through a friend of mine, went to a place called Hudson Institute. Hudson Institute was a major think tank on the East Coast, and I arrived at Hudson Institute, I like to say, a month after the Indians tested their peaceful nuclear bomb in 1974, and about 2 months before Hudson Institute received a major contract to study nuclear non-proliferation, because the then head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, Frederick Clay, decided, hey, this is a big problem, nuclear non-proliferation, so I'm going to get the two people that I know best to study this, Herman Kahn at the Hudson Institute and Albert Wohlstetter out on the West Coast. And so I was there with Herman Kahn at the Hudson Institute. There was nobody else to do the work. So suddenly I was involved in nuclear non-proliferation because of the Indian peaceful bomb. They called it a peaceful nuclear test. It was a bomb by any other means. And I never looked back. I just kept doing nuclear non-proliferation. And it's ironic. It's the same sort of thing. I wanted to come into the Reagan administration in 1981, and I believe it was again in May of 1981, the Israelis bombed the Osirak research reactor, and the then Secretary of State had the same exact reaction. Oh my God, I got to pay attention to this nuclear non-proliferation stuff because it could cause problems. So he asked his good friend, Richard Kennedy, who was the Undersecretary of State for Management, he basically said, hey, Dick, with everything else you're doing, take a look at this. And I had just asked Dick Kennedy, gee, could I have a job? And so again, it was fortuitous. So that's how I got involved in nuclear non-proliferation first at the Hudson Institute as an analyst, and then got involved in nuclear non-proliferation in the Reagan administration, first as a special assistant to Undersecretary and then Ambassador Kennedy, and then at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. So
quite a story. So
look,
timing is everything.
Timing is everything. And good work before that.
And
good work before that.
And in a way, each opportunity was born of a little nuclear crisis.
That turned out to be the case. That's true. That's right.
And so how did your early experiences, the people you worked for, the experiences you had, the real-world events, come to shape your view of nuclear deterrence and diplomacy and then the role of arms control?
Well, my main experience analytically was at the Hudson Institute, working with Herman Kahn, working with Don Brennan, and in that context, focusing on the spread of nuclear weapons. And so the first question that had to be asked was, well, what are the consequences if nuclear weapons spread? And what are the dangers? And so because of that, it was a sort of natural segue into looking at ways in which you could strengthen global efforts to prevent proliferation, and arms control, in this case, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, was a key way to do that. In addition, coming into the Reagan administration in 1981, there was an overall emphasis on trying to, on the one hand, strengthen American deterrence capabilities vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, but on the other hand, leave open the opportunity of some type of negotiations and arms control to try to avoid the worst possibilities of nuclear competition between us and the Soviets. So
terrific. Thank you. That idea that nuclear deterrence is the backbone of U.S. security and that there are opportunities for arms control is very contentious right now.
It is contentious, and I think that's because of, on the one hand, a misunderstanding of the extent to which arms control actually has been helpful in terms of achieving some of the same purposes of deterrence. And on the other hand, understanding how arms control can actually stabilize deterrence, can avoid the types of missteps that could be made. I think, if you look today, I think with regard to us and the Chinese, where the Chinese are in the midst of this major dramatic expansion of their nuclear forces, and the Chinese have this view of arms control as, well, that's something from the Cold War, as opposed to, no matter how much you try to argue with the Chinese, that arms control is useful because it might help to stabilize our relationship, might help both of us to avoid the risks of strategic deterrence, might help us to avoid wasting a lot of resources on a strategic arms competition that will serve neither of our interests ultimately. So I think it is controversial today. And of course it's controversial today because the two major other nuclear weapon states, the Russians and the Chinese, they don't want to play. They don't want to engage in arms control. And in that sense, with the Russians at least, it's very much like the period in the mid-'80s when we were negotiating with them. When in the mid-'80s, the Soviets walk out of the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces, and the strategic arms negotiations in 1983. And what happens is that over the course of the next, I would say, 6 or 8 months, the Soviets decide that they made a mistake, that simply breaking off all arms negotiations with the United States was a bad idea because it was going to increase their own insecurities, that the arms control process was useful to them. And that's part of the reason why the Soviets in 1984 proposed that the U.S. and the Soviet Union have a major set of bilateral discussions of nuclear non-proliferation in Moscow. And this was kind of they're tiptoeing back into a recognition that arms control served their interests as well as our interests. And ironically, the Soviet DCM came into my office in 84 to propose this and said they hadn't heard an answer because apparently the Soviet ambassador had proposed it to an assistant secretary and nothing had happened. So he came, they sent the next lower guy down and it worked out very well because it broke the ice. We had very serious discussions of everything related to non-proliferation, us and the Soviets, and it was a step towards the type of re-engagement that we began to see with Gorbachev coming in, and where Schultz, the Secretary of State, and Shevardnadze, the new foreign minister, could engage. And so that is a long-winded answer to your question.
That's a great answer.
I apologize.
I have so many questions I want to ask you now.
No.
What was that like having the Soviet DCM walk into your office to discuss possibilities for arms control?
It was striking, but what I was most struck by was the fact that the ambassador had proposed this, and in the infinite wisdom of the State Department, it got sort of shuffled away so nothing had happened. Because when this went to the then ambassador at large for nuclear non-proliferation, Richard Kennedy, he thought this was a great idea. He thought this would be, and the Secretary of State, Schultz, when he heard about it, he thought it would be a great idea. And it was really very, very productive in terms of setting a a new tone, finding a way that, despite the antagonism that followed after the walkout from negotiations, where the two sides could re-engage. And so it all fit together very nicely.
Why do you think it wasn't engaged with at the highest level when the offer from the Soviets first came in? Was it suspicion or other priorities?
I think it was because it was non-proliferation.
I see.
Non-proliferation was sort of the, non-proliferation, it was, that's something that somebody else does.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it had the pizzazz of, they want to do non-proliferation dialogue. I think that, so they just missed, the State Department just plain missed an opportunity.
That landed on your desk.
And then it came back to the State Department, who took the lead. Yeah.
Perfect. So you served the Reagan administration at a pivotal moment, I would say a series of pivotal moments. And what was the internal mindset around arms control writ large during those early years in the Reagan administration?
Well, I think the main mindset was strengthening deterrence, strengthening U.S. strategic forces. But there was a recognition, in part because of the NATO allies, a recognition that you needed to have two tracks. You needed, on the one hand, while you were making the argument for strengthening deterrence, while you were convincing your NATO allies in 81, 82, 83 to deploy the next generation of intermediate-range nuclear forces, the Pershing IIs and the ground-launched cruise missiles. While you were convincing the allies to do that, while you were doing all the deterrence activities, you wanted to keep open this channel. And that's why the Reagan administration actually proposed the zero option to the Soviets. Now, was that serious? Did anybody believe they would accept it? It probably depends upon whom you ask.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for some people it was probably a negotiating ploy. For other people it was something, actually, if they accept it, both sides could turn out to be better off, because then we wouldn't have all the burden of having to feed and water this whole new generation of ground-based nuclear forces in Europe, the missiles, and we'd avoid a competition in ground-based missiles.
Yeah.
Us in Europe, on our side of Europe, the Soviets on their side of Europe. So it was kind of both. And then, of course, what happens, the big change really is Gorbachev comes to power. And I don't think you can underestimate the importance. In November of 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev meet in Geneva. They meet in the first summit between the U.S. and the Soviets in quite a while. They meet, and they meet one-on-one with interpreters on the lake in a little boathouse. It was probably about the size of this room. And Reagan decides that, hey, this Gorbachev guy, maybe he really does want to change things. Yes, it's an evil empire, but maybe he wants to change it. So Reagan and Gorbachev, they kind of fit together just beautifully. Michael Crapon, the author, makes the same point, that they just fit well. They were the odd couple. You have a concatenation of the circumstances where the Soviets recognize, the U.S. is able to convince its allies to make a major move on deterrence. The U.S. is making a major move on its strategic forces. The Soviets try to pull the rug out from under everything by walking out of the negotiations. It doesn't work. And then you get Reagan and Gorbachev coming together, and these two leaders in the right moment manage, I think, to turn the situation around. And I would add that the 1985 NPT Review Conference takes place like 2 months before the Reagan-Gorbachev summit. And the 1985 NPT Review Conference probably benefits by the fact that this summit is coming. So there's a kind of, it's one of the, now one would say, one of the rare opportunities or rare occurrences where we actually managed to agree on a final document And I think some of it was because no one wanted to shake the boat because Reagan and Gorbachev are going to meet in 2 months. And I bet the Soviets didn't want to shake the boat. Anyway.
So Reagan and Gorbachev, they cultivated a lot of respect for each other over time.
Yeah, I think it was not only respect, but I have a sense that, Reagan liked people. And I think he actually, there was a sense of he could work with this Gorbachev guy. Yeah. And so it worked out very well, and it starts the process. And, of course, you had, at the Secretary Foreign Minister level, you had Schultz and you had Shevardnadze, and you had people under them who were also very capable on both sides. Yeah. And so
1985, you're preparing for this NPT Review Conference. This summit meeting is on the horizon. Tell me about preparing for the review conference and what you were hoping to achieve.
The most important thing we wanted to achieve was a reaffirmation of the importance of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But we also wanted to ensure that, because this is still the period where the U.S. and the Soviets are blaming each other for, why did arms control break down? Who did what to whom? Who shot John? We wanted to avoid a situation in which the U.S. and the Soviets spent most of the review conference attacking each other, putting on a display, if you will, for all the onlookers, so they could see this great show of the Americans and the Soviets attacking each other. So part of what my mandate was to try to arrange an informal agreement with the Soviets that we would both say what great things we were doing on arms control, but we wouldn't attack each other. And it took about a year, at least a year or so of in and out of Geneva, talking to the then Soviet ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament, to get this idea sort of understood. And I still remember at one lunch, the ambassador, someone named Victor Israelian, the ambassador said to me, now, explain this to me. How is it the case that we're going to go to this review conference and we're not going to attack each other? Explain to me how this works. So I looked at him and I said to him, Victor, this is how the porcupines make love, very carefully. And you had to take this. So Victor sort of understood it. Okay, we got to, and then about a month later, in our last pre-review conference lunch, he asked me about this, and he says to me, well, how do I know that your director, Kenneth Edelman, who did not like the Soviet Union for good reason, but Kenneth, how do I know that your director will stick to this deal? So I said, look, this is something that we've agreed to at the high levels in the U.S. government, and I'll write Edelman's speech, and so on and so forth. So, first day of the review conference, traditionally, the Americans speak first and the Soviets speak, like second or third. Edelman comes in, he gives this high morale speech. The Americans have been doing all these positive things for arms control. Here's our vision. Says nothing about the Soviet Union at all. Nothing. And 5 years later, I am talking to might have been 6 years later, because after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I am talking to a former Soviet diplomat, and he says to me, well, Louis, there were 2 speeches. I wrote 2 speeches. I had one speech which, if Edelman sticks to the deal, we use this speech. If Edelman does not stick to the deal, we use this speech. And so in the great Soviet tradition, they covered all the bases. But so the main thing, the first, is one, reaffirmation of the treaty. Second, work a deal with the Soviets so that we try to cooperate at the review conference. And it actually works out nicely, because at one point, at one point in the review conference, the most difficult issue was the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The Reagan administration opposed a ban on the testing of nuclear weapons. Everybody else virtually supported it, and the Mexicans in particular. The Mexicans in particular wanted some language endorsing CTBT. So in like the 11th hour, one of the people on my delegation comes up with language which says, the conference, except for certain states, endorses negotiation of a CTBT. So we thought we could live with that, and everybody else could live with it. But it's being discussed, and the East Germans start to make a fuss, at which point the Soviet ambassador tells them just to be quiet, leave it alone. So actually the little deal worked. But they had two speeches in case we stuck to our deal or didn't stick to our deal. But it made a difference, because I think what the review conference and the ability of the Soviets and the Americans to work together in the review conference, it showed, I think, the people higher up, I don't think so much on the American side, as much as, the Soviet skeptics. It showed them that, well, maybe we actually can, with the Reagan administration, they begin to move forward in a new direction. And so in those days, I would stress, and this is so different today, in those days, nuclear non-proliferation was one of the areas, even in the worst of times, as this example suggests, even in the worst of times where Moscow and Washington could cooperate. We cooperated on strengthening the NPT. We cooperated on trying to work proliferation problems. We cooperated on strengthening the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so it was different. It's different then. Now it's no longer that. And it's sad that the two sides cannot cooperate. I mean, now it's the case that you hear speculation, you read about, well, are the Russians helping the North Koreans, produce, more effective nuclear weapons? And that's a change.
It's a far cry from where we were.
Yeah.
So the NPT Review Conference opened successfully. There's this moment of alignment between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Tell me how the conference concluded.
The conference, we managed to sort out all the substantive issues. By the end of September, at which point suddenly I can't remember exactly anymore, some issue arises on the last evening with the Iranians, who were then participating, and ultimately at about 11 o'clock at night, the Australian ambassador convinces the Iranians on the floor to agree to a consensus final document, and it all gets, resolved, and it's resolved successfully. But I think what I took away, though, from the agreement on the consensus final document was that there was a strong sense amongst all the parties to the treaty that, one, the treaty was important, two, we wanted to reach agreement to show ourselves that we could reach agreement and to show our support for this treaty. And that also has changed in a way that was different, I think.
Yeah.
But
different times, very much so today. I want to move on to the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference. Of course, this was a critical moment in making the NPT permanent. Can you talk about your role in the lead up to and during that conference?
In the lead up, basically, I served as a advisor at the conference. I was on the delegation, partially, I would say, as an advisor, and partially as someone that the head of the delegation, Ralph Earl, could come to and ask, Lewis, why in the world did you agree to this in 1985? because there's a kind of continuity of this process.
Accountability.
Yeah. I don't know what, but it was. So I was there, and so I watched it unfold. I think it's probably fair to say that the most important player on the American side was Tom Graham, who was the ambassador, who believed from the start that you could gain support for indefinite extension, and worked hard. And so by the time we reached the Review and Extension Conference, the Canadians who were doing a resolution had actually produced enough signatures so you could have indefinite extension by a vote if necessary. And the key challenge was to try to have indefinite extension by consensus rather than by a vote.
Okay.
And there's still a kind of difference of opinion amongst some of us who were there as to what mattered the most. I think we all agree that the agreement on principles and objectives, a document which sort of looked to the future, was important in creating consensus. I think where we differ is whether the U.S. agrees to what's known as the Middle East Nuclear Free Zone Resolution, and the question is whether you could have still had consensus endorsement of indefinite extension of the NPT without the United States having accepted the Middle East Nuclear Free Zone Resolution. We could have had it by a vote. I think there's an overwhelming majority of countries that would have voted for indefinite extension. So indefinite extension was never at issue. What was at issue was whether there'd be it would be done in a messy way or an elegant way. And ultimately it was done in an elegant way by consensus. I think that the agreement to the Middle East Nuclear Free Zone, tipped the Arabs to supporting the consensus. Other people believe that, no, the Arabs in the final analysis would have come on board anyway because they wouldn't have wanted to be left as odd states out. But that's it. Though, I think the other thing that was really important for indefinite extension of the NPT was the language in the document which basically committed the United States and the other nuclear weapon states, the UK, the Soviet, the Russians then, France, and China, to negotiate a comprehensive ban on nuclear testing by the end of 1996. And the United States, I think playing a lead role, achieves that, works with the other nuclear weapon states. We managed to get that done. I won a dinner bet because I bet a friend of mine who was in the nuclear weapons business out at Lawrence Livermore, I bet him that we'll achieve a CTBT by the end of 96 as asked and as agreed to, as obligated to. And he said, no, we'll never do it. So I bet him that and I won my dinner because I think we took that. It was an example of how the United States, and I would say the other nuclear weapon states, took the NPT obligations very seriously. Whether that's still the case or whether it's now, sort of an afterthought is another question. Yeah. It's definitely not taken as seriously, I think, as it once was taken seriously for reasons that are a surprise to me a mystery to me, because it still is an extremely important treaty for strengthening both norms and institutions and legal obligations to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, which will not be good for anyone.
Terrific. Thank you. Were there any surprises, positive or negative, in how other NPT members approached the extension debate?
I think the Russians probably were supportive in principle, less actively involved than they would have been a decade earlier in 1985. But in the final analysis, when they had to throw their support into the process did so. I think South Africa's emergence as a major player was probably something of a surprise. So the South Africans were very important in terms of the negotiating of principles and objectives and their support for finding a way in which you could bring the parties together an indefinite extension. For some people, the fact that there was a ultimate majority was probably a surprise. And, by consensus was probably a surprise. For other people like Tom Graham, it wasn't a surprise. He thought that this was always going to happen, And I don't know what, you've interviewed or will interview Bob Einhorn, who was there as well. I don't know whether, Bob, were there any surprises? Bob might say the one thing that was a surprise was that the U.S. agreed to the Middle East nuclear resolution. So, but we'll see.
Great, thank you. How relevant is the NPT today, and what do you think its prospects for enduring are?
I think it remains relevant because it continues to express the view of the great majority of nations that nuclear weapons are dangerous, that preventing the spread of nuclear weapons is important. It provides, at a time when we may be moving finally into that long-predicted nuclear energy renaissance, when we may finally be seeing ourselves move into the use of nuclear energy in a major way once again. It's important because the structure of the treaty in terms of safeguards, in terms of the International Atomic Energy Agency, is important for ensuring that the peaceful uses of nuclear energy do not lead to the spread of nuclear weapons, which was one of the major drivers for the creation of the treaty in the mid-'60s. Was on the one hand, there was the Kennedy administration fear of a world of dozens of nuclear weapon states, but there also was the expectation that nuclear energy was going to be everywhere, so we needed to regulate it. So the treaty remains important, I think, for that reason. I think the treaty remains important also because it does set out a vision of a world in which nuclear weapons, if they're not abolished completely, they're at least, I like to argue, moved into the back room, where we're no longer as dependent on nuclear deterrence, where nuclear weapons are no longer, where we don't have to be in a situation where we have one of the major nuclear weapon states threatening to use nuclear weapons in a major conflict. So that's the vision of the NPT, and I think that's an important vision. And also I think that if we were to look at least some of the countries that show up on the list of possible proliferation risk countries, at least in a few cases, I am naive enough to believe that they're having accepted the obligations of the NPT make a difference. I think that I cannot but believe that in the case of Japan, any debate about whether Japan should acquire nuclear weapons will revolve partly around its NPT obligation. In the case of Poland, which is occasionally referenced, in the case of Germany, again, these are countries that have signed on to a legal obligation, so for those reasons, I think the NPT remains both important as a vision, but important practically as a set of obligations and institutions that depend upon it.
Thank you. Are we living in a period of the erosion of several nuclear norms right now?
I think we're living in a period of an erosion of the norm against the use of nuclear weapons. And I think we're living in that period because of a ultimately fallacious belief that the use of nuclear weapons can be controlled. Perhaps the most important belief that contributed to the stability of the deterrence relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was a belief on the part of both Soviet and American leaders that the use of nuclear weapons would get out of control. I think that belief is no longer present. It's no longer present on the part of all three of the major nuclear weapon states. All three of them believe that nuclear weapons use can be limited, and I, for one, believe that will turn out to be a big mistake if it's ever tried. And I'd rather not test the proposition. So yes, I think we're living in a period in which the norm of non-use of nuclear weapons is eroding. I think we're living in a period in which whether you call it a norm or whether you call it a realization, that efforts to cooperatively regulate the strategic competition between the nuclear weapon states is important. You can call it arms control. I would call it arms control. Let's just call it cooperative regulation. It is an important complement to keep deterrence getting out of control in any one of multiple ways. That recognition, a recognition that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that recognition has eroded.
Yeah.
So we are in a period of eroding norms, and it's not the situation where one would like the equivalent of a new Cuban Missile Crisis, or and hope that it works out the same way. But you could argue that the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 worked out the way it did as much because of luck as anything else. I mean, you're in a situation in which there's 3 officers in a Soviet submarine off of Cuba is being depth charged by the U.S. Navy, and they decide, they get together in a little group to say, are we going to fire a nuclear-armed torpedo in response? 2 officers say yes. The political officer, for reason unknown, says no. If he had said yes, and they had fired a nuclear torpedo, it's something bad would have happened.
The world would look different today.
So luck makes a big difference.
This idea of escalation control, that this is manageable, of course, this comes out of Herman Kahn's thinking, the escalatory ladder, and the metaphor that it was. Why are we so uniquely, writ large, committed to this idea that this is possible today? What happened to usher in this wave of thinking that you can have a limited nuclear war, that you can control escalation after first use?
It's a good question. I think it starts with the Russian military. So the Russian military finds themselves in a situation in which they believe they are at a disadvantage facing the United States and NATO. And they come up with this theory of using nuclear weapons in a limited way to shut down a conflict. It's almost as if the aspiration to get out of a box creates a view of how you might get out of the box. I think in the United States, there's always a stream of thinking about the limited use of nuclear weapons. You go back to the NATO doctrine of the early 60s. Flexible response. Flexible response included the possible use of nuclear weapons. But I think always in the background was a sense that, well, this is our doctrine, and if need be, we might try it, but we don't think it's going to work out well. Let's put it that way. I think that for the U.S., we're responding to the Russians thinking that they have to have a capability to use nuclear weapons in a limited way, and so we need to be able to deter that by responding in kind and hoping it'll work out well. I think that's what's changed. I think that there was a sense that this is a last resort and it's probably not going to work out well, to this is a sort of early on resort, which we think will just work fine. And I guess I'm a skeptic. I know people who disagree with me.
Yeah.
I know people who have spent their whole career in the nuclear weapons business who agree with me. So, but nobody knows. It's the great, but the challenge is to try to restore some type of engagement with the Russians and have some sort of engagement with the Chinese so that we could actually sit down and discuss these questions and discuss ways in which we could try to stabilize the relationship and avoid situations in which we might find, either of us might find ourselves thinking about the first use of nuclear weapons.
This idea that smaller yield nuclear weapons makes them more usable. Is this the culprit here?
I don't know whether I would, say that's the culprit. I mean, it's because, it was a 10 kiloton nuclear weapon that went off over Hiroshima, so it did a lot of damage. So, I don't think that's. I think it's a psychological change from the belief that the weapons will go out of control to the belief it's all based on assumptions anyway.
Yeah.
And this is the assumption. Sometimes I've thought that, and I've proposed this at various meetings, and it's been seen as a crazy idea. Sometimes I've thought that we should get the Americans and the Russians together to do the American Strategic Single Integrated Operations Plan, the PSYOP, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and do the Russian Single Integrated Operations Plan at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and do it. You could do it probably in this day and age of computer simulations, and lay it all down.
Yeah.
And the capabilities are an order of magnitude probably greater today than they were in '62. And just as a way to get the attention of well, what if it goes wrong? And what if it all doesn't play out the way you think? And that would be, and every time I've suggested this, people think this is somebody from the Hudson Institute who's forgotten what reality is. But it would be an eye opener. But do it with the real plans of those days. Do it with military to military. Not some sort of academic simulation. But but it's it's a problem that we confront. It probably starts at the top. And how do you work it on both sides at the top? In this case, I think, on the American side, I think we're much less inclined, to go down that path, whereas Putin seems to think of nuclear weapons as, something he can keep threatening us with.
That's his job, right? To make us believe that, right?
Well,
the deterrence is working?
Well, no, it's not deterrence. It's coercion. It's coercing us to act in ways that help him out in Ukraine. And that's working. And that has more or less worked. Yeah.
And so the psychological change, not related to usability per se, but controllability of nuclear weapons, perhaps because we've been studying the problem so long.
Or, yes, well, it could be that we've just... One of my good friends used to argue that one of the strongest contributors to the stability of deterrence between us and the Soviet Union was the fact that the Soviet leadership remembered the vast destruction of World War II. And for a long time, you had American leadership who came out of World War II.
Yeah.
And so it's a kind of forgetting. But it's not encouraging.
There are a lot of stories from the heyday of ACDA, which of course no longer exists. Do you have any you want to share?
Heydays from the... Well, I personally think it was a shame that the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency was traded away for a vote on the Chemical Weapons Convention and 2 future draft choices. Because what ACDA, an institution like ACDA, was exactly the type of institution that you need today. In other words, today, let's say ACDA, a mind experiment. ACDA exists. Okay, what would ACDA be doing today? ACDA would be sitting there, smart people in ACDA would be sitting there saying to themselves, what if the politics changed and suddenly the Chinese decided that, well, we don't want to engage in a big strategic arms race with the United States because it's not in our interest. What would some type of a negotiation, which wouldn't be arms control anymore, but something new, what would that look like? Well, we also have the Russians. What if the Russians decide that engaging in a major offense, defense, space, cyber, arms race with the United States, with all our economic potential and all our capabilities, is not in their interest, that they'll come out worse. ACDA would be sitting there and thinking through what the contours of a negotiation might look like. You know, from soup to nuts, from sort of, how do you do negotiations when there are 3 players? Okay, the Trump administration, the first time around, tried tripartite negotiations, and it didn't work. So what are the alternatives to tripartite? Well, what are you trying to do? If you're not going to have treaties, what would that look like? So ACDA was a residue of smart people thinking about what arms control would look like. Aside from carrying the infamous arms control torch, well, Henry Kissinger always used to say he loved ACDA because there were always 3 positions on any issue. There was the far-right position of the Department of Defense. Then there was the left-wing position of ACDA. And then right in the middle could be him, you know, the most reasonable option. And so ACDA stories, I guess I don't have any really good ACDA stories. I just have a sense. I just have a sense that it was a really very sad to trade it away because it was and now it's all gone anyway from the State Department. You know, in the big reduction in force, a lot of this talent, such as it may be, is gone. But it's not. It's not the same thing. So that's where ACDA, I think, made a big role. And the other thing ACDA used to do, and why it was important, is it used to make sure that decisions that should be made by the president were not made by a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. ACDA had the ability to dig in its heels on some non-proliferation issue and force it up the chain until it made its way over to the White House.
Making it highly unpopular at times.
Well, you know, what can I say?
Yeah.
But,
so we're missing a kind of whole-scale arms control imagination within the federal government. That's
a nice way to put it. It was a sort of arms control imagination. It was not just, he was the arms control torchbearer, obviously, but it was an imagination at a time when imagination is so necessary to think about how you get out of the box we're in, where arms control is seen as something that's the old days, because I honestly do believe that at some point with the Russians and the Chinese, they will decide that they want to engage. Now, conceivably, the driver to that will be, could be Golden Dome. Golden Dome, just like the fact that the Americans deploy Pershing II missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles in 1983 forces the Soviets to suddenly say, oh, gee whiz, we made a big mistake walking out of all these negotiations. The Trump administration pursues Golden Dome national missile defense, which in my view entails vast competition in all domains, in the air, on the ground, in space, and the Chinese suddenly say, "Hey, wait a second, this is a great way to waste a lot of resources." And the Russians say, "Well, we're backward anyway, so we can't, we'll never be able to keep up." And suddenly, now the real question then becomes, what's the likelihood that at some point the Trump administration would say that, well, we're willing to limit missile defense. We're back to where we were in the 60s when the Nixon administration, to start arms control, basically says, all right, we will limit our ambition for missile defense because we don't think it will work. It will be too costly. It'll create an arms race. All the same reasons of way back when, I think. But anyway, so I like the idea. So imagination, that's what's lacking in an active. Sometimes it was crazy. Sometimes it was a harebrained idea. But it was people with imagination, and that's what's lacking, I think. That's why it's sad that it's gone.
Yeah. So if you were to engage in some arms control imagination, you talked about the impact of a dual-track decision, opening opportunities for arms control. You've alluded to perhaps a window potentially opening for arms control in the future, whether a function of Golden Dome or in response to Golden Dome or something else. Do you think there will be opportunities for arms control in the future, and what should arms control look like?
What I've argued is that the first thing is really at the highest level to get the 5 major nuclear weapon states to sit down and ask whether they want to go into this world that we're going into of major offense, defense, space, everywhere competition. And I think that I don't believe that you're going to have 3-party negotiations. I think more likely you would have some negotiation, us and the Chinese, some negotiation, us and the Russians. And I think initially it would probably try to find some areas for unilateral restraint, agreed unilateral restraint. Okay, so I, for one, have never been a supporter of missile defense because I actually think it will turn out to be tremendously competitive and it won't ultimately not work. So I'd be willing to trade limits on what the United States does on missile defense for limits on what the Chinese do in terms of the numbers of their nuclear warheads and their missiles, because it's a very traditional trade. I think that part of arms control, though, is more. It's going to be more qualitative. So I would like to find a way in which I could get, if it's going to be, two little baskets, us, our allies in Asia, and the Chinese, us, our allies in Europe, and the Russians to get, talking to each other. I'd like to have us talking about what are the types of ways we think that a confrontation or crisis could get out of control as a step to getting into a discussion of what are the risks of using nuclear weapons. So I'd like to find, on the one hand, some examples of trade-offs of limited restraint where we could restrain something if they restrain something. And then on the other hand, I'd like to have a discussion amongst military and defense experts of how does our current confrontation spiral out of control, and what are the steps that we think of as showing robust deterrence and resolve, and you think of as preparing to use nuclear weapons against you. And conversely, so what are the things that you think of as a great way to show the Americans you mean business, but we think of as it's too damn dangerous. Now we have to do something even more extreme. So to have that kind of qualitative discussion.
Solid pitch for track twos.
It would be a track too, but I think it has to take place officially, though.
Yeah.
It's not just expert. I think expert to experts is important, and that helps. But beyond that, the serving military talking to each other as to how events get out of control, and what can we do to avoid that. And I'd like to be able to sit down and ask the Russian military the question that you asked me is, well, why do you believe you can control the use of nuclear weapons? And then the Russian military could ask the American military, why do you believe you can control the use of nuclear weapons?
Well, we do because you do.
Well, that's right, but that doesn't work in the real world. But what are the assumptions that we have? So, anyway.
Thank you. You've had such a long and storied career. What are you proudest of?
I think ultimately I'm proudest of achieving a consensus agreement in the 1985 NPT Review Conference, because I think it was important for us and the Russians to work together, and I think it was important to rally support for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think that is, in terms of my official life, I think that's probably what I'm proudest of. What I'm proudest of in my non-official life, which has been most of my analytic life, has been always asking the questions of an odd man out. Asking, pressing on the question of, well, why do you believe that nuclear weapons use would be controllable? And I guess I'm proud of having some reputation of having at least some arms control imagination at a time when imagination. Now, some imagination turns out to be harebrained, but but some of it turns out to be useful, and it prods people. I think I'm proud of prodding people to think about questions in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think that anybody who works in this business, given the dangers of nuclear weapons, should always be prodding herself or himself, and prodding the institutions to look at those assumptions. So you're not in the situation which we began with, of the famous man who jumped out of the 12th story window, and when he got to the 6th story, he was asked, "Well, how's it going?" And he said, "Oh, just fine." You're not in that situation because you're smart enough to look closely at your assumptions. And so I've enjoyed doing that, So anyway, but...
what is your advice to the next generation?
My advice to the next generation is, first to do good work wherever you are. Second, to believe in fortuna, that, or as MacArthur always said, something will turn up, but only if you've done good work where you were. Something you never know. You never know when the Indians are going to set off a peaceful nuclear weapon. You never know when the Israelis, well, nowadays it's probably not true. You never know when the Israelis are going to bomb some place with a nuclear facility. And so that you could be in the right place at the right time, and something will turn up if you've done good work. The third thing is, I would advise to continue always to tilt at windmills, because windmills sometimes move. So you have to tilt at those windmills because, my second piece of advice, once told me by someone at Science Applications International Corporation, and it applies, I think, generally. You have to throw those rocks out on the water because you never know which one will float. So you have to kind of have good ideas and interesting thoughts and proposals related to tilting at windmills, because you never know which one will float. You have to. So that's what I would advise, younger people, and I also would advise them that arms control, even if it's not called arms control, has a future. It's like the famous, statement, "The king is dead, long live the king." And so arms control, I think, will come back to life in some fashion because there's a need for countries to work together to avoid destroying themselves.
Are you optimistic generally?
I'm always optimistic generally, actually. Yeah, that's true.
Well, Dr. Dunn, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It was fun.